Good evening, everyone. Good evening from Scotland, and this is another podcast of the Embrace Stuttering, and we have a guest. Our guest today is Jonathan Brooks, who has very kindly agreed to speak to us. A bit about Jonathan, first of all. Jonathan is a first-year doctoral student at the University of Oxford and an aspiring academic. His main research interest is in the philosophy of psychiatric medicine with an emphasis on stammering disorder. Specifically, his research will consider how the uh, conceptual tools of philosophy might be utilized to offer a more holistic and meaningful conception of stammering disorder that avoids the pitfalls of reductive conceptions. Personally, as someone who has lived with an overt stammering disorder that has become far more covert in recent years and hopes to use his personal lived experiences with stammering to enrich his research. That is quite an that's quite an introduction. I just want to welcome you. I'm very for the holistic methods, because I think stammering is a holistic disorder. It's not just physical, it's not just emotional, it's not just mental, but all aspects are involved, and we have to treat and tackle every aspect. Um, could you tell us more about yourself, first of all?
So I suppose we basic fact about me is I'm from the southwest of England, a city called Bristol. It's where I'm born and bred. And I suppose I'm here to speak a bit about my experience of stammering disorder. And I suppose as a kid, I was always quite enthusiastic about speaking. In fact, I loved the limelight. I loved to perform. I loved the attention of people looking at me. And I'd say around primary school time, for those in the UK, that's around the age of, well, in particular, this was around year six in my primary school. So for those who don't go up from the UK, this is around 12 years old. Um, I began to become a bit more conscious of the fact that the way I spoke was a bit different to those around me. Um, and perhaps I can get into the story in a bit more depth later on, but essentially that's when um, something was different about my story, something was different about my experience of my speech and my experience of socializing with others, where my life got a bit more complicated in this way where I began to become a lot more socially anxious and self-conscious. And my story has very much been something of a battle or at least a stressed or um, strained relationship with speech that has at sometimes meant that I've shied away from speaking and at other times have meant that I've tried to overcompensate. So, for example, at school, um, it's interesting. So I was just talking about my final year of primary school. By the time I got to my final year of my secondary school, I was the head boy, and uh, part of my responsibility was to lead assemblies. So I would speak in front of my entire school, um, twice, sometimes three times a week. And I think part of my desire to take that sort of position was partly because I wanted to prove to myself and to others that I was verbal, that I could speak, that I could not just speak, but that I could perform verbally and under the pressure of being in front of an audience and all of these sorts of ideas were kind of, I think, behind my motivation to even apply for the position. And I think, like most people who, or at least most people in my experience who call themselves persons who stammer, there have been ups and downs. It hasn't been a constant journey. There's been twists and turns. And as you mentioned in my introduction, it's kind of led me in my research to sort of trying to put this part of my life story under the microscope a bit more to work out um, what is this thing we called stammering disorder. And I'll stop there.
That's really interesting. Had a similar story when I was younger. I felt my speech was different, but you don't give these things names. You don't know what stammering is. You don't know what stuttering is. I just knew that my speech was halting, hesitating, like like a faulty car engine, and it wouldn't go smoothly. And I felt that I had to ended up using a lot of force when speaking, effort, and I started avoiding speaking when I had to make phone calls in those days. We didn't have mobile phones. We had actual phones with um landlines and phone boxes. I used to ask my brother or my sister to make phone calls for me, and and I felt inferior for years because I couldn't make phone calls, and I got afraid that I wouldn't be able to function in adulthood, and 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 um and yeah, I felt really ashamed of myself, and and family members tried to, well, they insinuated that I am inferior, and and they always, the common theme in my family and extended family was that that Hassan wouldn't be able to survive on his own. Uh, and I believe that because when you keep hearing that from childhood, you you believe what you hear. So I completely, yeah, understand that. And I just want to ask about your head boy experience as an assembly. Uh, how did that go for you? And speaking to the school.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Um, so I remember um how I felt applying for the position in the first place. It very much felt like I wanted to challenge myself and also prove myself, as I said. And I think when you're applying for a position, it's somewhat theoretical because you're imagining yourself in that position, sure, but it doesn't compare to the moment I found out, okay, I've been selected amongst my peers to actually fulfill this position. And then there was a moment of sort of celebration. My parents, my family were proud of me, um, and I felt quite honored to have been selected. But then when it came down to the day to day, what comes to mind is it's like trying to build a house without a foundation. I think this role sort of increased the pressure on me and showed me personally how much weakness there was at the foundation of my self-confidence, how vulnerable I was to the opinions of others. You mentioned your family. Certainly in this context, it was my peers. I really cared about what my peers thought about me, what my teachers thought about me. And I think all of this weight and I suppose even the recognition of my weakness, my underlying sort of, I don't know whether to describe it as like a moral weakness, a lack of courage, or um, certainly for me, it felt like it was almost a weakness in a medical sense. There was something really wrong with me. Why can't I be like others who would take on this role and would probably find the public speaking to be a bit scary, but all right. And then would probably struggle more so with the organization. For me, the organization wasn't too hard, but the prospect of speaking publicly in front of my whole school was more than daunting. It felt like walking a plank. It felt like putting myself in a position where I could literally, well, not literally, I suppose, like, socially die. I could be, yeah, I suppose it was, I couldn't see it. I didn't have the, almost the capacity to see speaking in front of my school as something that was an opportunity for me to succeed so much as an opportunity to fail. Um, and it was as though my two options were either I perform really well, in which case I am sort of sufficient or satisfactory, or I don't perform perfectly well, in which case I'm a failure. So really skewed towards like a really negative bias, and certainly was my own worst critic. anything if I ever misspoke or felt like it was I, I'm thinking about it now. There's so many levels to this. So there's sort of the level of perfectionism regarding the content of what I'm saying. Am I making sense? Am I being coherent? There's perfectionism at the level of maybe execution of the sounds of the speech I want to say in terms of am I repeating, um, am I stammering at all? So maybe I should say repetitions was the kind of for me the stammering symptom that was sort of most frequent or getting um yeah sort of just stuck in repetitions with the sound. Then there's also almost emotional perfectionism. Can people tell that I'm nervous? Can they hear my voice shaking? And I need to get all of these layers um, in alignment to make sure that they're all sort of in check for the perfect performance. Do that at least twice a week. Sometimes I speak to my whole school twice a week, then to my um, year group once a week, and then at the end of each half term, it speak to the entire school and also to the parents. Um, and you could imagine with all of that sort of weight, the days leading up to each um, time I spoke, I would be rigorously preparing, going over my words, making sure that I know exactly what I'm going to say. I would even choreograph jokes I'm going to put in because um, I wanted to come across as though I was being spontaneous and I wanted to present the image that I was this great orator, this great speaker. Um, again, to reach this almost impossible standard, and it meant that I had a lot more sleepless nights, just really focusing on um, these performances. Um, and last point I'll make about this is sort of the cycle I was in. I only ever felt as good as my last performance. It wasn't as though if I were excellent 9 times and I were to be less than excellent the 10th time, I sort of be fair-minded and say, you know what, John, that wasn't your best, but you know what, look at this other 9 times. You did so well. So on this time, there's a bit of grace for you. It was more so on that 10th time, I've been exposed. Now they see what I truly am. The weakness that I've been spending all of this time trying to bury and to hide. In some sense, the mask has been lifted, and they can see that I'm not like them. I'm not as good as they are. I have this defect, this deficiency, and it was no way to live, and that was a large part of my experience.
So, so that was your experience in school when you were in high school, and
That's right. Yeah.
that was in Bristol.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And um, were you ever made fun of by other children, or laughed at, or teased, or bullied?
That's really an irony in the story. I was only ever teased once, and that one occasion, I don't think anyone really thought there was something wrong with my speech so much as it was a moment of disfluency. So this was around, I was around 14 years old. I'll say my age rather than the year, given that this is an international audience. Not everyone here is from England. So I was around 14 years old, and I was in an argument, and I remember sort of getting passionate, wanted to win the argument, and the eagerness and the passion caused me to become this fluent. And I think I was repeating on some sound like ruh, 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 ruh. And I think quite quickly the person I was arguing against saw that and took advantage and said, well, something like, oh, you can't even get your word out, so your argument's clearly false. And then context being, I'd already had the seed sown in my mind a few years earlier that there was something wrong with the way I spoke. So for me, I took that as sort of confirmation that he can see that thing that I suspected. And I said to him in response, not my fault that I've got a stammer. And uh, I kind of threatened then to tell the teacher, suggesting that it was to bully me if he was to speak about the way that I spoke, and I couldn't help speaking that way. And he sort of backed off, and he was quite scared about being told off, so he didn't really pursue that any further. So I kind of felt like I'd won the moment in that sense. But in another sense, that was a turning point for me because that was the first time I sort of identified as a person who stammers. And maybe the first time I felt as though this was obvious to my peers and being confirmed by those around me. And I think that was part of, maybe it's worth beginning to differentiate between sorts of two types of symptoms here, because there's the stammering behaviors themselves. But you mentioned a word regarding your family that I think it's worth really spending time talking about, which is shame, which is comes under sort of the psychological and psychosocial aspects of stammering disorder that for me were the worst part. So I could handle repeating or being disfluent in a particular moment, or I keep saying repeating, repetitions is the term that people tend to use. And I can handle the behaviors, but it's really the hardest part for me was the shame and the fear, the emotional aspects, and the way that I thought about myself. So you might call those the existential aspects, the things that are kind of hard to quantify. But yes, there was just that one, that's your question, come back to your question, and there was that one moment where it was actually pointed out by a peer, yet it's colored so much of my experience, it's quite disproportionate. And that's why I would say that most of my experience of stammering is actually more so covert rather than overt. It's the attempt to hide the fact that I um might be disfluent rather than the disfluencies themselves, rather than it being obvious to others. Because I think if you ask any of my school friends now, did Jonathan ever stammer, they'd say they've never heard it in their life, which is part of the irony of this situation. It's more so battling with those psychological and existential aspects of stammering disorder that's characterized my journey.
You know that the more compassion I have for myself and people, the more I realize that children, even adults, well, they will find something that's different and use it against you, and that's just human nature. And we're always looking for weaknesses in people, and for example, it could be anything. It could be, oh, you wear glasses, or you're this and that, or um red hair, or something like that. And but when I was younger, right? I I remember many instances which I couldn't read out in class. I dreaded introductions when you go around the room and say your name. Um, dreaded introductions in school, in college, in courses, in university, everywhere. I really dreaded introductions. And what happened was about 2 months ago, I am, I am, I have I have I have a young daughter uh, who's now a year old. I took her to her class on a Saturday morning, and it's a class for very young uh, ch children. And so I took her to this class, and we were all sitting on the floor. The the parents from the mothers or fathers, or mother and father with a baby. So it was me, as my daughter, as my wife couldn't come that day. So then the I don't know, the instructor or the coach of the class or the teacher said that we're going to go around, and all the parents have to introduce their children to the class. And I just had a flood of emotion, and I thought, when I was younger, I was so afraid of this situation. Now I'm 45. I've come full circle now. It's my daughter. When I was younger, I may have walked out of class, say, "Oh, I need to use the bathroom," but I said, "No, I'm not going to walk out." So all the parents introduced their child to the class, gave their name. So it came up to me. I had to say my daughter's name, and I felt this intense speech block. Couldn't say it, and I said, listen, I want to tell everyone something. I have a stammer, and I have always dreaded introductions since I was school, college, work, whatever. But now, when it comes to my daughter, um, I'm not gonna let my fear um affect her education. I'm not gonna let her let let my fear become contagious. I'm gonna say her name. So I had the block and I held it. I held it. Um, it felt like an eternity, but I said it, and everyone just applauded. And I can't say it felt good, but the fact that I hadn't made some excuse, it 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 felt good actually. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I thought I should share this story with you. I mean, even though I hadn't overcome my stutter, my block, I just felt some of the shame lift as I hadn't let my fear affect affect my introduction of my daughter in a class. So yeah, so I thought I would share that, see your thoughts on that.
No, it's a really interesting and moving story actually. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the question of what can overcome shame. If shame is one of the most difficult aspects of um stammering disorder, or I think in America you guys call it stuttering. Um, what overcomes it? And I think one of the at least so far as I've seen, and I should add the caveat, I'm just this is my first year of research. So what do I know at this stage? What sort of in my thinking so far, and it may well sound cheesy, but I think love is something that really is a powerful antidote to shame, in the sense that if I think about the direction that shame points me in, I'm very much thinking about myself and how I'm performing and how I'm going to underperform in the eyes of others. And very much I'm on this sort of mission, this project of presenting myself well to others. And it's very sort of inward looking. And honestly, I think I spend so much time stuck in my head. Um, and subconsciousness is definitely one of the things that I found to be an aspect of my experience that's been quite difficult. I'm always sort of monitoring my speech, stuck in my head to this extent that I can't really engage with my emotions, how I really feel. I'm more concerned about making sure that I say the right thing in the right way. Whereas love is the direction of love is outward looking. I'm thinking about not what I can sort of do for myself, but how can I give to others? How can I protect the person I love? How can I share something valuable? Um, and it seems like the opposite of being so insular, so self-conscious, so self-critical, and I don't think that's the only way to sort of reverse that direction of focus. I think there's maybe more neutral places to direct your focus as well. You and I both are friends with Lee Lovett, and he has many things to say in the way of sort of you might say therapeutic interventions or cures, if you're comfortable with that kind of term. And one of the things he recommends is that you sort of focus on, rather than the sound you're trying to make, focus on the emotion that you're trying to speak with. So maybe engage with the emotion, or modulate your voice. Getting your mind, I think, anywhere away from focusing on yourself and that sound that you're struggling with, um, I think is going to be moving away from the kinds of patterns that get you stuck in the cycle of stammering behaviors and shame experiences. Um, I can share my own experience, not as I don't know, as nice as the one that you shared, but and I suppose there's some parallels. We'll see how it sounds. But I was at a conference. This was this year during my first year of my doctorate, and I wanted to raise my hand and ask a question, something that I thought would contribute to the discussion. But unfortunately, I felt really fearful, and I was worried about how I'd perform. I feel quite nervous. I can feel my heart beating, my palms are getting sweaty, and I know that when I open my mouth, my voice is going to be shaking, and I might not be very fluent because I'm so nervous. And at this time, I was going through some uh, speech therapy that was trying to encourage me towards forms of exposure therapy, which is to say, sort of the thing that you fear, essentially give yourself a dose of that in a manageable way. I'm not don't try to do it all at once, otherwise you can end up traumatizing yourself. But I thought maybe I can try to give myself a dose of the thing that I fear. Maybe I can kind of just accept the fact that I may well sound nervous, but actually what I want to do is to contribute to this discussion and I want to grow, um, not just to sort of perform in their eyes and kind of continue the same cycle of being an almost a slave to performance, but I want to actually kind of face this fear that I have and decide that I'm going to raise my hand at the risk of sounding in some way imperfect. And I noticed that when I was able to face that and focus also on the goal, um, then sort of their evaluations of me, then the fear really lifted significantly. I don't think it went away completely, but it reduced significantly to the extent that I was like sort of in awe and surprised that wait a minute, where did the fear go? And I think it just showed me really the power of having a focus beyond just this project of I need to make sure that I'm performing well and appearing and presenting well for others. But if I can focus on something less sort of really self-centered, if I can focus on what I can give, what I can share, how I can attain that goal, then or how I can get into my body more and experience that emotion, or just something else to get out of your head, I think that would go a long way.
I think that's really inspirational, Jonathan. I've got a question for you, but I'm going to see if anyone else has a question first. I think we've got Alan and El Kogan. Do either of you wish to ask Jonathan a question?
Yeah, so I thought what you were saying about love being the antidote to shame is very, very interesting. And yeah, it's not, and that aspect of self-consciousness is definitely something I can relate to a lot. And I was wondering if and yeah, so just wondering if you were saying this is like I actually something that you're um like is this a topic that you're focused on phil in your philosophical research? Because if so, that'd be very interesting to read up on, but it's hard to imagine that as like a very analytic topic, I guess. So
Yeah, thank you for that great question, Alan. So I'll start with the last part of what you said. Absolutely, it's love sounds so abstract. It's a really hard thing to sort of quantify and to empirically investigate with the usual methods of research that we might apply to stammering disorder, especially these days. I don't know how much you know about stammering research, but a lot of where the money is going these days is into sort of neuroscientific, hard-nosed research, let's take a look at the brain scans and correlate that with different behaviors, and lots of genetic studies looking at what are the genes that would dispose you towards stammering behaviors. And a lot of it's quite far removed from talking about things like love, compassion. Though I would say, to the first part of your question, will my own research touch upon that? Well, that's one of the things I have, thankfully, the flexibility to do as a philosopher of psychiatry as opposed to a scientist, because the scientist will be using more sort of often neuroscientific and biological methodologies and have to quantify things and apply scales. Whereas as I suppose as a philosopher, the approach I'm taking is looking at the science of stammering, the psychology of stammering, the sociology of stammering, and the philosophy of stammering, so much as there is a literature, which really there isn't much at all. And trying to make sense of the various these various perspectives. I think they've all got something valuable to contribute, but I think unfortunately nowadays the research is very much skewed towards the hard scientific approaches, and in particular, what I find interesting, that I haven't gone into very much yet, but one I hope to go into, is self-compassion therapy, which actually is getting some traction in psychological research, not with respect to stammering in particular, but in general. So what's probably more popular is mindfulness meditation therapy. I think that's really gotten big over the last several decades. And sort of within that space is an emerging literature on self-compassion therapy, which comes from the same roots as the mindfulness therapy, but focuses on showing love to yourself. And there are two researchers in particular whose names might well come back to me throughout the course of this meeting, but right now I'm drawing a blank. And the reason why it's quite encouraging to see this research is because they've been able to show, for example, that when you apply this kind of self-compassion therapy, we can show quantitatively that it has certain results on people's so they'll measure things like sort of self-efficacy, which means how able you feel, or rather how you feel about your ability to go and do things. Do you feel like you have greater ability or less? And questionnaire data can show that actually when you focus on a person's ability to sort of love themselves, you might think, and this is sort of the maybe how do I describe this? You might think that if you tell a person, love yourself, you're great as you are, that it would encourage them to be sort of more lazy and to sit back and think, yeah, I'm great, so no need to really do anything or to change because I'm great as I am. But actually what you find, Kristen Neff, the name just came back to me. I think that's another example of sort of your focus determining your success. So I kind of knew that if I didn't focus on trying really hard to focus on the name, that it would come to me, which is part of really what self-compassion therapy teaches. It's more so about being open than trying really hard. But yeah, so what they actually find is rather than people getting sort of more lazy and more comfortable, is that actually when you tell a person or teach a person to love themselves, they actually feel a sense of vulnerability decrease. You feel more empowered to go take that risk because actually you have that safety blanket that your value isn't on the line. Your value isn't in the hands of others to determine. You feel more empowered to go and do that speaking engagement or to go for that qualification. I won't speak much more to that because again, I'm sort of getting started in my research, and but absolutely, it's something I hope to incorporate in my understanding of stammering disorder, why it develops, and how to what therapeutic interventions to use in order to ameliorate the symptoms.
Huh. So how do you think self-compassion, because the first thing that I thought of when you mentioned self-compassion slash self-love is that, like, because before it was like the reason why love being an antidote to shame is that it seems that love is inherently outward facing, but then when we talk about self-love, that, well, now that seems interesting, because it's like, well, now we're back to this inward facing mechanism, or at least so it would seem, perhaps.
That's a great question. I think you do quite well on a philosophical course like my own. Um, I think the best way to try to resolve the paradox, because it is something of a paradox, but if you can imagine yourself as, rather than sort of one unitary thing, but you can actually have a relationship with yourself. So I mentioned the term, for example, existential earlier on. So I'll describe sort of a not very compassionate relationship with yourself, and then how a compassionate relationship would look, and how both sort of have that sort of outward looking focus, yet it's turned inwards. So I mentioned the scene of me being at a conference, wanting to raise my hand, and the fear that I was going to sort of expose the fact that I was nervous by having a shaky voice. And the fear wasn't, I should say that the fear wasn't that I was going to say the wrong thing in this case, but it was more so that I would be exposed for having the shaky voice. So that tells me something about the judgment of the behavior, if you might call it that, of having a shaky voice. My relationship with my shaky voice was somewhat judgmental. I'm suggesting that there's something wrong or bad, maybe even disordered about having a shaky voice that maybe signals to others that I'm not as good as the rest of them. So in some sense, I'm directing my attention towards this part of me that's out there. My voice is something that goes out into the room, and I'm judging it. That's to have a negative relationship with something that's kind of inward because it relates to me, but it's been projected outwards. Whereas a self-compassionate relationship will see the fact that I've got a shaky voice and say, actually, I'm a human being. I don't have to be perfect. Maybe I have a personal history of stammering, and that's the reason why I feel a bit more nervous about speaking. But actually, anybody can have a shaky voice, and it's not always to do with being nervous. And you might say, actually, you know what? Even if you show this supposed form of weakness, I still value you. I still think that you're just as much of a man or a good person or a moral person, or whatever you think of that state. So there is a bit of a tension there, a bit of a paradox, but hopefully that helps somewhat. But let me know if you've got a follow-up question, because I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I mean, it's certainly intuitive that self-compassion is a good thing. It can, and it can be healing. But it's still, I guess I was fixated on this whole inner slash outer thing, and so, but yeah, we can table that, I think. So
Yeah, and actually, I think it's really helpful that you asked this question, because as I mentioned, I'm early in my research, so I need to be able to think about how I can best respond to questions like this in a very clear and coherent way. So I'll give it some more thought. Maybe what I want to say is more so something like the first point, that it's therapeutic to have an outward focus, such as love for another, and maybe that caveat of love for another helps to resolve a paradox. If I maybe I'm going too far to suggest that love is always outward focused. Perhaps sometimes it can be inward focused, and then I wouldn't need to sort of think about how the self can both be inner and outer, and maybe that would be a more straightforward way of making the point. But I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, that was very interesting question from Alan. Just from my own interest, just a question to Alan. Which part of the world are you from, Alan?
I'm from, well, so I'm originally from Texas, but I'm currently living in New York.
Okay, okay, yeah, good. That is very, very interesting.
Oh, you muted yourself.
I muted. I thought I unmuted myself. Well, yeah. The question that what did I say now? Yes, I've got a question for Jonathan now. What is your views on disclosure? Because because what I find is if I don't disclose and then I kind of start to block, etc., then it's harder for me to disclose after that. And sometimes I can't even say, excuse me, I have a stammer. I can't even say that. So I think for me, if I'm making a presentation at the start, I normally just throw it in. Listen, I've got a stammer. If if I hesitate slightly, that's why. And just to see what your views would be on that.
So I think a good starting point, and I try to remind myself of when I think about these questions, is that we are human beings first, and by that I mean that there's a degree of complexity that we need to always appreciate. So I'm not a big fan of rules for all people for all times. So I don't want to say you should always disclose or never disclose. There's kind of two things at least to bear in mind. First of all, where are you at in terms of your journey? So maybe it would make more sense to disclose for a person who feels less control over their speech, or maybe a person who feels more fear and shame around their speech. Perhaps it would be more beneficial for that person. And secondly, who, or rather, how do you disclose? Because I wouldn't want to sort of become like too apologetic and almost grovel as though I'm admitting this really shameful thing about me, if the goal is to sort of begin to build some sort of pride within yourself. I don't know if that would always be conducive to sort of be apologetic about how you disclose. So when I was receiving speech therapy, my therapist gave an example, and she seemed really dignified in the way she disclosed, or really matter of fact. Even she didn't really make it a big deal. She just said, "Yeah, so by the way," and she was on the phone for this example. She said, "By the way, I've got a stammer, so just in case there's any gaps or silences, that's what's happening." And she wasn't saying, "Oh, sorry." It was more so, "This is just the case." That being said, in my own experience, I think I, by default, do become very apologetic, and um, I'll share this experience of disclosure that I'm currently working through. So whenever I go to the shops, I do a form of disclosure, which is actually intentionally stammering. And that's not me saying explicitly that I've got a stammer, but it's me trying to um, show that I stammer and sort of be okay with showing that, which again is a form of exposure therapy, as I mentioned earlier on. And what I found is something really interesting, which is that whenever I would voluntarily stammer, I kind of found myself in terms of my posture there where I was speaking shrink, and it was almost like I was embodying the kind of character that I think a stammerer is, that the kind of person whose voice isn't as valuable, the kind of person who probably isn't as authoritative, who is somehow like socially lower than others. And I've really been trying to work on this, the idea of like both stammering and being dignified, to stammer with dignity, to look a person in the eye and to do it, which I can admit right now is for me quite a scary thing to do, especially given that my history has been for so long to try to present this polished image of myself. So I think it's kind of just shown me partly what's been going on beneath the surface. I don't know, have you probably have come across the Sheehan's iceberg model of
Yes,
stammering?
yes, yes, I have.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to hear your experience, but I'll share mine briefly, which is just that I remember drawing out the image of the iceberg, and then writing out all of the things that I associate with stammering. Um, and I suppose above the surface there were these behaviors, but beneath the surface I remember all of these really horrible feelings of like shame and disgrace and disorder, all of these negative thoughts and feelings. And it wasn't until I did that exercise that I began to realize, oh, so this is why I spent all of these years working so hard to run and hide from these behaviors, because I associate them with really negative things like stupidity, immaturity. I'm not really a man if I can't confidently command the stage and speak, and in all of these ways that I feel less than. And I think now also doing the exposure therapy, um, doing the voluntary stammering, I can understand why I kind of put on this character, is because I've got all of these negative thoughts associated with stammering that kind of come to life when I do voluntarily stammer. And what I'm trying to work on now is that dignity aspect, and kind of just being okay with the fact that I might well present as a person who's stammering in that moment.
No, no, that is really really interesting. Um, I find when I'm doing a presentation, it always helps me take some pressure off if I either disclose it or if I do like a voluntary stutter at the start, and I'm not even mention it. And yeah, just for the listeners, the iceberg is, we only see 5%. The physical stuff is just 5%, and the stuff people don't see is hidden underwater. So if we can tackle that, I'm going to finish off with a question which I was asked to ask you from someone who shared a research shared a research link from Oxford, and since you're in Oxford, I was asked to ask you the question. So yeah, so uh, um, it's in a number of messages, so I've got to now formulate what the actual question actually is. That the basically put, um, is stuttering, is it genetic? Now, is it genetic, and can we cure stuttering uh by um by developing therapeutics to counteract the genes, or sorry, or stimulating the area of the brain which is underactivated during speech? Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Really great
Mm.
question, and a lot to unpack, but I'll do my best to do such a large question justice. Um, I suppose the first thing to say is stammering disorder is complex. So yes, there have been gene studies that have shown certain correlations between genes and stammering. And I'm not a geneticist, so I won't speak to that too much, so much as to say that it's not as simple as they found a stammerer gene, but it's more so there's various genes that have been associated with stammering. There's been correlations made. A sophisticated understanding of genetics, and again, I'm not a geneticist, but if I understand, is you have to always understand the relationship between genes, which is the biology, and the environment. Nowadays, there's lots of talk about things like epigenetics, which is to say, there's an investigation as to how environmental factors can actually activate genes and turn them on. So it's not enough, for example, to put it in simple terms, for you to have the most musical genes in the world if you never pick up an instrument and activate them. So sometimes we can sort of overstate the importance of genes and understate the importance of environment. But even looking at genes and environment isn't the whole picture, because it's more complex than that. You've got your biological dimensions, you've got your environmental dimensions, you've also got your psychological dimensions. So I mentioned before, it's a good example. I mentioned before during my school time, because I felt as though my speech was different, there were times where I decided to overcompensate by doing more public speaking for another person. They might try to shy away. And actually, my decision as to what I do in this context can actually contribute towards greater disfluency or less. And I think personally, I found psychological interventions to be really helpful in terms of increasing my speech fluency. And then there's also, we can talk about existential dimensions, but I think that's probably enough to get a sense of how complex this thing is. So the thing that you shouldn't be thinking is, it's as simple as my genes made me do it, or my environment made me do it, or my psychology made me do it. There's so much interacting that there are various points at which therapies can intervene, and there are various points at which therapies do intervene. There's various therapeutic interventions on offer. You mentioned also in terms of zapping the brain. Actually, Oxford is kind of the hub of the neuroscience of stammering. I feel like I always need to sort of caveat that's not my area. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've spoken with the foremost neuroscientist of stammering disorder, Kate Watkins, who's based here at Oxford, and she's doing research into something called direct transcranial stimulation, which is zapping a part of your brain to try to increase your fluency. This kind of research is in its initial stages, so they've seen some success with other psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, I believe, and a few others, but this is something that's very much developing for stammering. Having said all of that, the thing that really interests me in terms of talking about cures, which by the way is something that we need to define in terms of a cure, because it's not the same for everybody. But something that really interests me is the fact that in most cases of persons who stammer, there are contexts in which they speak completely fluently. So there's something that I'm going to be doing some research into called the talk alone effect, which is to say that there are contexts in which, and like when you're talking alone, in which you can speak completely fluently. And this is really bizarre, right? So if you have a disease, I don't know, or even more simple than a disease, if you've broken your leg or your knee at the point of your knee, it would be really weird if you could run really fast when you're on the football pitch, but you are limping when you're on the road. That's not how lesions, bodily breakdown tends to function. But in the case of stammering disorder, and this kind of speaks to the nature of this thing, it isn't that simple. And it's because it's not just talking about a biological problem like a broken knee. We're talking about something that affects the entire person, and it's the I think what one needs reminding sometimes is that it's not brains or genes that stammer, it's the entire person that stammers. It's a person who's stammering. How that manifests isn't even just in your mouth, but part of your stammering experience might be that you are tense in your body. It might be that you have fears before you stammer. It might be that persons actually experience meanings. You go into a context and you make meaning or you interpret the context. So, for example, for me, when I go to speak in front of my entire school, I see that as a very daunting and scary context, given my history of stammering. For another stammerer, they can go into that same context of public speaking, and for them, the meaning they make in that environment, their interpretation is, alas, this is a context where I can hold the microphone, I can speak, and I won't be interrupted. Um, all of these things speak to the complexity of stammering disorder, and in particular, honing in on the talk alone effect. That tells me that the ability to speak is in you, it's in the person. The ability to speak fluently without necessarily knowing the mechanics of how you're doing it, or knowing how to set your tongue to make a plosive sound, or how to do the right breathing technique. There are contexts in which you can do it spontaneously, and I'd be interested in therapeutic approaches that want to start from that reality and work on expanding the zones in which you are able to speak fluently, because there's a reason why in that context you as an individual find it a place where you can speak fluently. Maybe it's because you feel confident, maybe it's a place where you feel indifferent. Maybe it's a place where you're focused on loving another. Maybe it's a place where you're focused on a greater purpose. Maybe it could be any sort of number of factors. And that makes me hopeful. That makes me hopeful that if by clear you mean speaking fluently, no matter what genes you have, if you're able to speak in at least some contexts, why can't that be expanded? I can say from my personal story, I feel as though I've got a lot more control, a lot more mastery over whether I'm going to stammer. The thing I'm working on more so now is the experiential aspects, working on feeling shame and anxiety and fear. And those things have certainly been cured. So I should say in amongst academics, it's kind of taboo to say that stammering can be cured or it can be overcome. And it's for good reason. I think a lot of the time, and I'll try not to go on too much about this, but I think it's because um, it's really hard through current therapeutic practices to get a person to actually become fully fluent. And I think after decades of trying and trying, they don't want people to feel let down when they don't, when they're sort of promised to cure, then they can't actually cure. And I think there's also been in the background lots of pride movements to do with stammering, the idea that you should accept how you are. And that's come from other sort of social factors, other types of pride movements that kind of come into the stammering space. And I think there's also been an increased recognition that the most difficult aspects of stammering disorder are not the behaviors themselves, but it's more so the fear and the shame and the anxiety. And those are the things that a lot of stammering therapy nowadays wants to focus on more, which I think is great. Nevertheless, I do quite firmly believe that all of the stammering symptoms can be overcome. Not that it would be easy, because it would require changing patterns. And actually, I mentioned the biological aspects, the psychological, the social, the existential. It would require probably doing work in many of these areas, and maintaining the work too. But yeah, I'm definitely optimistic based on all that I know. That's what I'd say about that in a very big nutshell.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is acceptance does not mean resignation. So I like that one. Okay, I think that's been a very interesting talk, and we should definitely do this again. You know, I know you have a very heavy workload, research, reading, writing, etc. So I and the viewers are very grateful that you gave us gave us us some of your time. Um, um, and and yeah, so thank you very much.
Well,
Okay.
thank you very much for having me, giving me a platform with which to.
At all, at all. I'm going to stop recording now, and then we can have a 2 minute informal debrief, and yeah, thank you.